We Have Ways of Making You Talk presents The Cauldron by Zeno. Read by Al Murray. Chapter 21. Adams frowned as he watched Bridgman make his way behind Gorman's houses and up towards company headquarters. The platoon commander's movements were erratic and hard to reconcile with what Adams knew of the safe areas and the danger zones. He would amble along for a few yards, double sharply for a few paces, and then fall back into a leisurely walk, his chin sunk on his breastbone and then thrown up with his head moving alertly, his Sten gun hanging limply from his hand and then in sudden readiness across his body. 20 yards short of the bushes and shrub which lay to the south of the headquarters, Bridgman stopped. He stood as a man might who was looking out to sea from a cliff top, his mind far out over the waters. Adams saw him sway slightly, shake his head and then drop to the ground. He crawled laboriously into the cover of the bushes. As Bridgman disappeared, Adams felt the muscles round his throat contract. He became as frightened, although in a different way, as he had been on the first day of the landing. He was watching the first sign of disintegration in an idol, the flaking at the edges of a man he had thought indestructible. If Bridgman went, Adams could believe anything, that they would never get out, that the war could be lost, that he would never see his home again. The first shell burst from the artillery barrage broke the train of Adams' thoughts, and he snapped alert, the skin tightening on his scalp and his eyes opening in apprehension. The barrage built up, reaching a new high pitch which surpassed anything Adams had experienced before. The company area and the ground between it and divisional headquarters were the targets, and the shells crashed into the gardens and houses without pause, till all sound became one unbroken roar. He saw a chimney stack and part of the roof of one of Gorman's houses disintegrate like a child's toy struck by a heavy hand. A shell burst in front of the stable where Brogan had his aid post, and when the smoke cleared, Adams could see the half door hanging drunkenly on one hinge. Another burst in the gardens midway between Adams and Gorman's position, only 20 yards from where he knelt behind the window breastwork. Without actually losing contact with the floor, he felt himself lifted by the blast, and as he sank back he relaxed completely so that the whole of his body and head were protected by the brickwork. Now that he could no longer see, the noise seemed to increase and close in on him, as if sound itself were a weapon of the enemy, a weapon to beat him senseless and incapable of action. He lay down at full length on his stomach and cupped his hands over his ears. He could feel his thighs and calves trembling, and for minutes he lost touch with the world about him as he fought to control his muscles. And when at last they stilled, he found his arms and shoulders shaking in their turn. Their movement stopped instantly when the house he was in was hit twice in rapid succession. The close crash of brickwork and the tearing of timber high up in the third story was more real, but strangely less frightening than the enveloping roar outside. Adams forced himself across the room to the door, trying frantically to remember if any of the section were above the ground floor. He moved on his hands and knees, and because he dragged his rifle in his right hand, he had to stop and think how to open the door, staring at the knob for some seconds before reaching up awkwardly with his left hand and turning it. He crawled out into the hallway and nearly bumped his steel helmet against Bignell's as he crawled from the room opposite. Bignell rested one hand on Adam's shoulder and putting his mouth close to his ear, he shouted, "Get down the cellar, but stay near the top of the steps. Here, take this with you. If you feel me pulling on it, get out as quick as you can and join me in there." Bignell jerked his head at the room he had just left. "I shan't pull unless they attack. I've sent the others down already." Bignell gave Adams a rough push towards the cellar head and crawled back into the room he had left. Adams looked down at the cloth in his hand, and his eyes followed the strips of curtaining till they became a tablecloth and disappeared round the upright of the door. He crawled to the top of the cellar. It was dark, but a faint glow showed somewhere below in the darkness. He turned and felt at the stairs with his feet, easing his body slowly down the steps. He felt sodden and heavy, like a sack of wet wheat, and his flesh registered nothing when it made contact with the sharp edges where treads and risers met. Only the bones in his hips and elbows told him that the weight descending was a body and his own. Marsden opened the door and Hardy slid into the hall. As the corporal closed the door again, Hardy leaned back until his shoulders rested against the wall behind him. He was breathing asthmatically, his breath whistling out between his open lips. He had come 50 yards through the barrage and he was exhausted to the point of collapse. "What is it?" Marsden's voice was sharp, impatient. "Gorman sent me over. The Germans are in the next house." Hardy stopped talking and breathed quickly, the urgency of his lungs making faint rasping sounds at the back of his throat. His eyes seemed to tumble and drift in his head, signalling the incoherence of his mind. He took 2 deep breaths and shook himself. His eyes stopped their wayward drift, and when he continued his voice was controlled. the next house to you, not us. Mocock saw them at the window and hit one. They didn't come up the road. They must have worked their way through the gardens on the south side. You're in trouble. What are you going to do?" Marsden stared at Hardy for a moment without seeing him. He was visualising the layout of the two houses. They were a semi-detached pair, and the one the Germans were in was the one hit by the flamethrower the day before. He had vacated it because he had insufficient men to hold both. Now the enemy were 9 inches of brickwork away from him. His only hope lay in the possibility that the Germans did not know that British troops were in the house next to them. They had been fired at from Gorman's position, and it was just possible that they were preoccupied with the danger from that direction. He bent down to unlace his boots, at the same time raising a hand to his lips. When he spoke, his voice was a hoarse whisper. "I'm going to mousehole them, if they don't mousehole us first. Bridgman's gone to headquarters. You better tell Blake what's happening. He's just gone back to his section about 10 minutes ago. If they don't know we're here, we've got a good chance. They won't see you if you go straight back. This house will screen you. I don't see how they could have seen you get here either. They may just have spotted you as you went across the stable, but that doesn't matter. Have you got any plastic?" Hardy rested the muzzle of his rifle against the wall and saw Marsden grimace at the scratching sound it made. He slipped his haversack off his shoulders and unbuckled the straps, reached inside and took out 2 pounds of the plastic explosive they used to fill the stockingette of the gammon bombs. He passed it to Marsden. He would be glad to be out of this. He hesitated for a moment, then whispered to the corporal, "Not much point in telling Blake. There's nothing he can do. I'll stay and give you a hand." He took his gaiters off and started to unlace his boots. With his head bent, he could not see Marsden's face, but he could guess at its expression as the corporal's whispered words reached down to him. "I knew it. All you bloody public school blokes are the same. All bloody heroes. It's funny, too, because you all want to live. You all want to go back to your tennis and your cricket. If I was like you and Roy," he stumbled for a moment, remembering Fraser's death, "I'd be at the bottom of the deepest cellar. I wouldn't care how I finished the war, just so long as it was in one piece." Hardy stood up, grinning. It was the first time he'd heard Marsden on the defensive. It made him feel better. "Come on." Marsden jerked his head irritably and headed for the stairs, Hardy following him. "We'll flush him out from the top. Lavity's not too bad. I'll stick him at a window on the south side with a Bren. Gorman's got the road covered. They'd hear us getting into the attic, so we'll go through the bedroom walls." Signalman Dwyer's head jerked up, and he slid the earphones over his ears and listened. The old man was calling Ramsden, reassuring him about the headquarter position. They signed off, and Dwyer combed back through his hair with his fingers, pushing the headpiece off so that it hung round his neck. In the half-light of the cellar, he felt choked, restricted. He loosened the camouflage veil round his neck and then reached down and unclipped the tail of his smock. He felt no better. He ran the zip of his smock down as far as it would go and opened the front of his shirt, undid his fly buttons and pulled his pants away from his crotch. The air touching parts of his flesh which had been covered for so long made him feel a little easier, and he put a hand inside his shirt, pulling the clothing away from his armpits and rubbing at the wet hairs. He eased his testicles away from his thighs, experiencing a mild pleasure as the cooler air struck between his legs. The faint stirring on the steps below him, where Chambers and McGrath rested, came to him like country sounds heard from a distance, and the pressure of one of Adams's boots on his right shoulder became light and of no consequence, like the hand of his girl touching him lightly. He had lain like this on his last leave, disordered and unbuttoned behind the haystack where he had made love to Molly on the day before he had returned to the company. They had lain there all the afternoon and half the evening. It had been the first time they had had each other, and although he had never admitted it to any of his friends, it had been his first time with any woman except the whore in the brothel in Algiers. The only thing that had worried him since was the doubt that it was her first time with a man. She had seemed so sure in her movements compared with his uncertain awkwardness. He was glad he had had her. His first. He wondered if she was to be his last. Woodley scratched his beard with one hand and beat a silent tattoo on the blanket-covered table with the other. He tried to keep his eyes on the 3 houses which Gorman had insisted he and Summers treat as the primary danger, but every now and again he threw a quick glance at the house next to Marsden, which had been occupied by the Germans. From where he was, he could see the back door through which Hardy had disappeared 15 minutes earlier. He wondered vaguely why he had not come back. The fire in one of the 2 burning houses had gone out, but the other was blazing fiercely. The wind was not strong, but it was steady and carried sparks and writhing tongues of flame towards a third as yet untouched house. There was a house alight between one platoon and company headquarters, and beyond the HQ flames and smoke were so thick that it was easy to believe that all the northern part of Oosterbeek was on fire. The earlier fires in Arnhem proper must have been got under control by the Germans, for he could see nothing of them now but occasional gusts of heavy smoke from still smouldering ruins. "Now I know how Nero must have felt. It's inspiring, you know, in a way. You're a musician, aren't you, Woodley? Do you feel any inclination to play?" Woodley took his gaze from the three houses, which were beginning to dance and change shape as he watched them, and turned his head till he was looking at Summers' profile. His head turned very slowly, each jerked inch of movement requiring a separate effort. When he spoke, his words came thickly, reluctantly, as if they were loath to leave the security of his mouth. His tongue felt woollen and strange, barely alive, and as foreign to his mouth as a sick furry animal that had crept in for shelter. "I don't care if I never play again, just so long as I get out of this alive and intact, and that gets less likely every bloody hour." Summers continued to watch the houses, but he pursed his lips in a deliberate, consciously judicious way. "You surprise me. I should have thought the artist in you would have lifted you above such mundane thoughts as survival at any cost. But of course you don't believe in survival at any cost, do you?" "No." Yes, I do. What does dying in the right way matter when you're dead?" "Not at all, when you're dead. But I think the moment of dying matters very much. Death is the ultimate object of life, isn't it? One might almost say that it is the orgasm of living." "Now you're talking balls. An orgasm is pleasurable, something which in life we try to attain and repeat over and over again. Death is the end of all pleasure, the end of music and dancing, of eating and sleeping, the end of love and orgasms. You're talking cock." Woodley's voice had risen in a sudden, hysterical anger, and the thickness of his tongue and mouth made his voice almost a squeak. "I want to go back to the music and the dancing and the eating and the sleeping. I want to go back and make love to beautiful girls. I want to have physical orgasm, not mental ones at the point of death, but I suppose you—" Woodley saw the skin tighten on Summers' cheek, and he changed what he was going to say in a stumbled rush of words. "I suppose you think those sort of ambitions too commonplace. They're not elegant enough for you." Summers threw Woodley a surprised look, then looked back at the houses. "Why are you here, then? I don't mean in the army, you had no choice about that, but why the parachute regiment? Why the independent company? Why are you at Arnhem? All the acts which brought you here were voluntary ones. Did you choose the parachute regiment because you thought it held the greatest chance of survival, the greatest chance of returning to your whining and dining, to your music and your orgasms? Now who's talking balls?" "I'm here for the same reason that most of us are here, because I was bored to death in the unit I was in, and I was ready to do almost anything to get out of it. Now twist that into something else." "And this was the only way to break the monotony?" "You can't ask me to accept that. It's too bloody specious and you know it." Woodley turned his head back till he was looking out again through the empty frame of the window at the sombre picture of the dead road, the crippled tanks and the burning houses. His brain worked sluggishly as he tried to unearth the real reason, the first impulse which had sparked off the chain of events whose end lay here in the smashed and burning houses of Oosterbeek. He noticed idly that the third house was now well alight, and that the first house, which had appeared to have burned out, was blazing fiercely again. In a way, Summers was right. It hadn't just been Borden, but his crawling mind refused to close with the problem. It was too big, too far away, and he didn't want to know. A series of muffled explosions, so close together as to sound like a racked cough, came from the direction of Marsden's corner house, and Woodley's eyes went from the far end of the road to its nearest corner. Smoke and dust hung as a dissolving screen in the heavy air outside the windows of the semi-detached pair of houses which Marsden's men and the Germans shared. As it cleared, Woodley saw the door of the farther house open and two grey-clad figures burst out through it into the garden. He started to swing the MG42 round, but before his head had dropped to the sights, the door in the nearer house opened, and Marsden was crouched just clear of the porch, firing bursts from his sten at the two Germans. A movement at an upstairs window drew Woodley's eyes up, and he saw Hardy firing at something out of his sight in the garden. Almost at the same instant, Cassidy's face appeared at a bedroom window in the second house, the one the Germans had occupied. Woodley could hear a Bren firing from the other side of the buildings, and he guessed that some of the enemy were trying to break clear to the south. Marsden slipped into the second house, and Woodley waited for the next move, his body tense and his face slack. The seconds ticked slowly away, and he felt his eyes begin to close. The muscles in his neck ached with the effort of holding his head up behind the sights. He guessed that Marsden and his men had blown their way into the upstairs bedrooms, and then, while a couple of them followed up with grenades, the others had waited for the surviving Germans to break out. He heard a 36 grenade burst. There was a pause and then a burst of Sten fire, and as the sound of the grenade reached him, Woodley saw the tiles lift on the roof of the second house. They were clearing the attics. He heard a single shot, and then minutes of silence. A rifle with a veil tied tightly round the muzzle was stuck out from a lower window. It was waved twice quickly and then withdrawn. The house was clear of Germans. Woodley swung the machine gun back onto the 3 houses at the bottom of the road. He glanced at Summers, who smiled back crookedly. "Well," he asked, "what's the real reason for you being here?" Woodley felt anger begin to rise in him, and then it was gone again. He shook his head wearily. "I don't know. I really don't know. Whatever the reason was, it was a bad one. I wish to Christ I'd never heard of the bloody regiment. I suppose you know why I'm here, why we're all here." Summers continued to smile, but he looked back down the road, his eyes raised above the houses, so that they took in only the white cumulus clouds which drifted above the smoke of Arnhem. "I can't know," he said quietly, in a voice almost diffident, "but I think I've a pretty good idea. A few, the youngest and those who have never grown up, they're in this because of the promise of excitement, the chance of glory which they saw as an abstract thing. But most are in for a very different reason. Nearly everyone who deliberately puts himself in the way of dangers, driven to some degree by the death wish, they—" "Bollocks! If you think I've any wish to die, you can think again." "I don't think you have, now, at this precise moment. I think that with people like you, and I think most of the people who have the death wish are people like yourself, the seeking of death is a subconscious thing. And what's more important, something which can be worked out, destroyed by experience. For you, the discomfort, the sordidness, the sheer bloody misery of this preparation for death has driven out the desire for it. Even for your subconscious, it no longer has any attractions. It's not death which defeats your subconscious purpose, but the hard labour of dying. You're not dedicated enough." Woodley did not answer, without moving his head or his body. He had gone to sleep. Bridgman faced Blake in the faint light shed by the lamp which the Dutch civilians had kept burning in the far end of the cellar. "I want you to take over tonight, Bob. I'm going to sleep here. I'm going to sleep all night. I reckon that tomorrow will be the last day. One way or the other, it will finish then. And I want to be fit for it. Get Gorman to relieve you so that you get some rest, but don't wake me up unless it's the real thing. I'm sorry to do this, but I've misjudged my own physical ability pretty badly. I've overdriven till I've stuffed myself. Taking only an hour or 2 won't do me much good." Blake nodded. Bridgman was right. In his present condition, he was a greater liability than an asset to the platoon. All his reactions would be slow and his judgment bound to be faulty. "Very well. I'll make one last round, and then I'll stay by the set unless something happens." Blake hesitated for a minute, then asked, almost as a matter of form, "Anything to tell 'em, sir? Any news of Second Army?" "They're trying again tonight, but if they slip only a few hundred over to us, it'll do no good. They'll have to make crossings of at least brigade strength if they're going to do anything worthwhile." "How's the CO and company headquarters?" "The Germans have closed right up to them. They're facing each other from opposite sides of the street. The old man's cheerful enough, but it's pretty serious. If they take headquarters, Mr. Brown's platoon and this section will be cut off by directed fire from one platoon, Gorman and Marsden. There's nothing we can do, Bob, except leave it to the old man and trust to luck." Blake said good night and climbed up the cellar stairs. Bridgman moved over to a space at the far end of the cellar and sat down with his back against the brickwork. He looked at the 9 Dutch men and women and children who lay or sat along the wall to his right. For 3 days they had barely moved except to relieve themselves, or eat the little food they had. The only water they had drunk had been fetched for them by members of the section in the house above their heads. There had been very little of that, and Blake said there was no more to be had. The last static tank had been drained. There was not a drop of water left in the company area. They were good people, Bridgman thought, as he looked at their huddled figures. They hadn't whined once. And when they had to ask for something, they did so quietly. If their request was refused, they accepted the refusal without complaint. He stretched out at full length and pulled the collar of his smock up till it half covered his face. He relaxed his body, letting his breath out in a long sigh that seemed to last for minutes, and his body became suddenly heavy as if a great weight were pressing down on it. In one sector the Germans had granted a truce so that the wounded could be handed over to them. Tim Jordan had said that at one time there had been 1,500 wounded men packed into 3 buildings. It couldn't go on. Tomorrow would decide.